Walter Berns was once a scholar and a patriot. And that, unfortunately, in the contemporary world and in contemporary America, is kind of rare.
Patriotism is not natural, but has to be taught or somehow acquired. And the question was then, and I suppose still is, how was this new patriotism to be taught or somehow acquired by later generations of citizens?
On the one hand, he loved the country, thought people had to be encouraged to love it for reasons that had been stated by Walter's great hero, Abraham Lincoln, especially in a free country. It can't be taken for granted that people will simply love the country and do the things that are needed to protect it.
This was not simply the rah-rah patriotism of a war hero, which he was.
So Walter was a veteran of World War II. He had served from the absolute beginning in the Navy. He had seen action. I used to like to tell my children he had taken North Africa single-handedly, when they were still young enough to believe that. And so he had a very powerful sense of what the country had been through. And Walter in particular had a sort of odyssey after World War II. But eventually they pitched up in Taos, New Mexico, where a artist colony had been founded.
He was going to be the, great American novelist, but then eventually he burned the manuscript. I just decided that wasn't him and wound up going to the University of Chicago. And someone told him, you have to take a course with this fellow, Leo Strauss. And Walter said, I said, I'll do it next semester. And finally he did.
He was very greatly influenced by Leo Strauss, and Leo Strauss said, we should go back and read Aristotle. We should go back and read old books because we can still learn things from old books. And it's not enough to say, I don't completely agree. All right, you don't completely agree. What is it you think is right? And if you start by saying, well, no one is right, if there is no right, you're just going to go through life chortling and chuckling and being frivolous and silly, and that isn't the life Walter Berns was going to lead.
Walter believed that true patriotism for an American includes an appreciation of self-criticism.
We are not expected to love our country simply because it is our country. Love can be blind, and love of country, like love of wife or husband or lover, can be blind too. But ours is not supposed to be a blind patriotism.
But he always insisted that our criticism of the Constitution be fully informed, that criticism had to be based upon a full understanding. And it was that fuller understanding that he spent a good deal of his life in reviving.
Walter Berns was one of a very small group of scholars who made the founding relevant again and really fundamental to our understanding of ourselves. We take it for granted now that, well, of course, if you study America, you have to read the Federalist Papers and you have to think about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and John Marshall, not just the latest Supreme Court cases, and you have to read Lincoln. That was not the case when Walter Berns began writing on these topics in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And he and a small group of friends and colleagues of his really revived the study of the founders, showed why you couldn't understand America without understanding the founders.
I think part of what happened to Walter and to a lot of other people is that the left changed out from under them and came to really reject the vision of the Constitution. To be a partisan of the Constitution, which is, if Walter was any kind of partisan, I think that was his party, by late in his life meant that he was a conservative by default. But I don't think he was a conservative in the way that the conservative movement understands that term. I can see how Walter would be uncomfortable with the term, and a lot of people of his generation were. But the fact is, he and they transformed conservatism in a way that made it more like them. I think what today's young conservatives mean by thinking of Walter as a conservative is purely a compliment. It means that they see themselves shaped by his teachings.
Walter Berns was at AEI when I came here in 1986, and he was here for all of my tenure as president, up until his 90th birthday. He was in the office every day. Right up to the end, he was the complete intellectual and the archetype of what AEI has always tried to promote and insinuate into larger political debate.
When Lincoln was a young man, he gave a speech about the Founding Fathers in which he called them a forest of giant oaks. I thought Walter very much represented that image. These were people in the founding whom Lincoln felt had greater challenges than his own generation. Walter Berns was one of the giant oaks Lincoln spoke about, and he's left an extraordinary legacy for those of us who are still here at AEI, his scholarship and his great strengths as a colleague and friend to many here.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to those here who braved the rain and those watching online. I'm Gary Schmidt, a senior fellow here at AEI in the program on social, cultural, and constitutional studies. It's my honor to introduce Yuval Levin, who will be giving today's Walter Berns Constitution Day address, How to Take the Constitution Seriously. Yuval is the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy at AEI. He is also the editor-in-chief of the journal National Affairs and is the director of the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program, a program in which legal and constitutional studies, under Yuval's guidance and with the support of AEI's President Robert Doar, has once again regained a place of prominence in AEI's scholarship. Finally, Yuval is the author of several excellent books in political theory and public policy, the most recent of which is American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. It was recently published by Basic Books. Well, the format tonight is pretty simple. Yuval will give the address, then I'll take the moderator's prerogative asking a few questions, and then we'll turn to questions from our guests here and those online. Now, before turning things over to Yuval, I thought given tonight's topic, it might be appropriate to recount a story that Walter Berns himself told toward the end of AEI's first Constitution Day event in 2011, an event in which three close friends of Walter's, Leon Cass, Jeremy Rabkin, and Christopher DeMuth, discussed Walter's work. And as with many of Walter's stories, this one was both witty and substantive. The following are Walter's words. Some 3 decades ago, I came to AEI and found my old friend Robert Goldwyn in charge of the Constitution program here, and I joined that program. As a part of that program, foreign scholars and statesmen and stateswomen interested in the American Constitution were invited to come here to discuss the Constitution, its institutions, and its underlying principles. And a number of us went elsewhere and talked about the American Constitution in countries abroad. We visited France, Portugal, Cyprus, and on a very important occasion, South Africa. We also went to countries in this hemisphere, for instance, Mexico, Chile, and Brazil. Brazil was an especially interesting experience. Mind you, in each of these cases, I was talking to people who essentially, for the first time, were involved in writing or considering a new constitution for their countries. Brazil, in this case, had just rid itself of a military dictatorship, and they were considering how to advance the cause of constitutional government there. I spoke in various places, usually before law school audience. I think it was in the law school in, excuse my Portuguese, Recife, where after I finished my prepared remarks, an individual, probably a law professor, certainly an angry Brazilian, stood up and denounced not me, but the person who had invited me to speak. He said, quote, "Why did you invite the American here? They've had only one constitution. Why didn't you invite somebody from Bolivia? They've had hundreds." On that note, Yuval, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gary. And thanks to all of you for being here. As Gary says, braving the rain, and also those who have found us online. That film, I have to say, which we watch every year, is an increasingly depressing look at my own younger self. I'm sure the rest of you don't feel that way, but it also reminds me that we've been doing this for a while. It's really, for me, a great honor to deliver this 13th annual Constitution Day lecture. I've gotten to attend all of the prior dozen, and so when Gary suggested that I be the speaker this year, I was daunted and honored, though I wondered if those buildings in New York that skip the 13th floor might not know something we don't. But really, the speakers that I'm following here set a bar that I can only aspire to. But it's especially an honor to do this because the lecture is named for Walter Berns, one of my heroes. I got to know Walter a little in the last decade or so of his life. I certainly didn't know him as well as some of the people in this room personally. But I've also spent an enormous amount of time with Walter's writing, learning from him in the way that you can only really learn from the written words of a profound and brilliant thinker. I've learned from Walter about patriotism and civic education, about Locke and Hobbes and the nature of the liberal society, but I've especially and above all learned from Walter about the US Constitution. Some of what he's taught me has been substantive and particular. He was right about the First Amendment 50 years ago, for example, and the fact that a lot of constitutional thinking, including on the right, has taken a very different path from his, I think reflects poorly on that thinking and well on him. And the way he approached that question has become only more relevant in the age of the internet and social media. But above all, I've learned from Walter about how to think about the Constitution, or maybe it's better to say I've learned from him about just what the Constitution is. Walter was a constitutional scholar, but he was not a lawyer. He was part of a group of political scientists, political theorists really, who made the Constitution their subject starting in the middle of the 20th century, so that along with the likes of Herbert Storing and Martin Diamond, Robert Goldwyn, even Walter's sometimes nemesis Harry Jaffa, Walter insisted that the Constitution was more than just law and should be studied by more than just lawyers. Lawyers are important, and constitutional law is a very vital portion of constitutional theory and practice, but Americans have left too much of our constitutionalism to lawyers. And the result of that, Walter argued, was that, quote, the Constitution came to be seen not as the embodiment of fundamental and clearly articulated principles of government, but a collection of hopelessly vague and essentially meaningless words and phrases inviting judicial construction. Walter wrote those words in the conclusion to a collection of his writings published in 1987 that was called Taking the Constitution Seriously. And ultimately, that's what he has taught me to do, to take the Constitution seriously by seeing what it really is in whole. And that's what I want to lay out for you in this talk, my sense of what the Constitution is. It's my sense and not Walter's, and so I can't claim his authority for this conception of it, and he should not be blamed for the errors in it. But the pursuit of this kind of conception, the conviction that the Constitution is law but also more than law, and that to take it seriously would require us to see it in full, is certainly something I owe to him. So let's consider the Constitution in Bernsian terms and see how we might take it seriously. To start with that strange question, what is the Constitution, is a kind of peculiar choice. On its face, the Constitution is a fairly short document. It's about 7,500 words with all the amendments included, and it describes the goals and powers and institutions and key rules of our system of government. But of course, the Constitution is more than a document. It's also that system of government itself, brought into being by the words on the page, but embodied in a set of offices and officers and laws and norms and habits and traditions. It's the essence of the American regime, which is by now the world's oldest and most durable democratic republic, and it decisively shapes the political ethos of our society, even the character and dispositions of the American people in some important ways. The Constitution can be all of these things because it is, in essence, a kind of framework, a structure or form that matches means to ends. And to try to capture its key facets, we can think about the Constitution roughly as a five-part framework. It's a legal framework, a policy-making framework, an institutional framework, a political framework, and finally, a framework for union or unity. These aren't alternative descriptions. They're all true of our constitutional system at the same time. But at different times, we tend to prioritize them differently, with very serious consequences for how we understand and live out our common life as a nation. To really take the Constitution seriously, it would help to consider each of these in its own terms briefly. And so first, we might think of the American Constitution as, of course, a legal framework. It is that, a text duly enacted that establishes a set of rules that can be put into effect by public officials, interpreted by judges in response to cases and controversies. The Constitution calls itself the supreme law of the land, and it is certainly first and foremost a legal document in that sense. But understood as law, the Constitution is, above all, a set of constraints or structured boundaries on power. Some of these are expressed as personal rights, in effect defining protected spaces around individuals or communities, spaces that other people or the government can't enter. And some are expressed as definitional constraints on the institutions of our government, placing a broad category of governing powers, like the executive power, in an office, but then shaping and defining the structure of that office and to channel, to contain that power. In both those kinds of cases, the Constitution as law defines boundaries, and then judges, as interpreters of the Constitution as law, patrol those boundaries and insist on their enforcement. There's a vast space for public and private action within the boundaries that are sketched out by the Constitution, a space meant to be filled by the lawful actions of public officials and citizens. But broadly speaking, the Constitution as law is more of a negative or protective instrument, a shield more than a sword. And that makes sense, since the judge, unlike other constitutional officers, can only really be called into action when a complaint or a case presents itself, when someone can reasonably claim that a boundary has been transgressed. That's not to say that the Constitution, even as law, is therefore purely procedural or devoid of substantive purpose. Limits necessarily speak of a purpose. They're there for a reason, and that reason is deeply rooted in an understanding of the ends of government. And the work of the judge, the interpretation of both statutes and the Constitution itself, is among the most important influences on the public life of our free society. So the Constitution's standing as our foundational legal framework is first and foremost the grounds of its significance for us. And yet there's no question that a view of the Constitution that takes in exclusively or largely its legal character would be a kind of blinkered view. It would suggest that our system of government is at its heart a system of limits on government, and that the problems with the constitutional system in our time are essentially functions of people doing things they shouldn't do in ways that judges ought to stop. That is not really what some of our most significant constitutional problems actually involve now. Much of what's wrong with our constitutional practice is not illegal, and the tendency to leave American constitutionalism to judges alone is frequently a kind of dereliction. Ultimately, the Constitution is a lot more than a set of procedural boundaries, not only because it's our highest written law, but also because it is more than just law. Ironically, contemporary critics, particularly on the right, who argue that limiting the judiciary largely to policing procedural boundaries would lead to a constitutionalism devoid of moral substance, have themselves too narrow a conception of constitutionalism. They identify the Constitution entirely with law and its practice entirely with the work of the judge. But judicial restraint is actually a means of protecting the space for legislative and executive and civic action. And that kind of action is very far from morally neutral. To confuse the work of judges with the entire work of living out the Constitution is to undermine both the judiciary and the rest of our system. The Constitution's role as law is essential to its fuller purpose, and it's reasonable to see the system first as a legal framework. It sets the boundaries of what our federal government may do, and those boundaries can't be violated for the sake of other constitutional ends. But what happens within those boundaries is also constitutionalism, even if it isn't always law. So second, we might think about the Constitution as a policy-making framework, a set of tools and authorities that enable a government to address practical problems by enacting statutes and implementing them, by raising revenue and spending it, by creating public programs, administering them, by taking policy action in response to needs and events. Our Constitution was adopted above all because its predecessor, the Articles of Confederation, was grossly inadequate as a policy-making framework, and the new system certainly did establish a far better one. Policymaking is a lot of the substance of everyday governing. And in this arena, the judge's role is muted, and the legislator and the executive come to the fore. Their objective is to make law and carry it out in pursuit of substantive public goals. They're bound by the limits that the Constitution imposes on the uses of government authority, but within those limits, they're meant to deploy that authority. The Constitution as a policymaking framework is therefore primarily a set of powers Policies and programs direct those powers to meeting public needs and satisfying public desires, and officials are judged as policymakers based on how well they do that. The Constitution is rooted in an understanding of the great importance of effective governance, and the case for it has always put great emphasis on policymaking. Its framers believed that government incompetence undermines a society's self-confidence, and with it, the capacity for self-rule. Now, there is clearly a tension between the Constitution as a legal framework and the Constitution as a policymaking framework. A view of the system that prioritizes the capacity of government to act has to chafe against a view that prioritizes boundaries on action. And so policy-minded constitutionalism has always clashed with legally-minded constitutionalism and insisted that any system of government that is assigned goals as ambitious as those assigned to our Constitution has to be granted powers sufficient to achieve those goals. But like a legalistic constitutionalism, this kind of policy-minded approach to our system tends to monopolize our thinking about it and to crowd out other priorities. Approaching the Constitution as a policy instrument is plainly justified and crucial up to a point. Our system exists to enable a government to address public problems and meet national needs. But there is also more to government than policy. It exists to secure basic rights and to structure political relations, among many other things. And that requires us to think about the Constitution in terms other than policymaking, too. Arguments from policy, like arguments from law, can't simply trump other modes of constitutionalism. The authors of the Constitution clearly recognize this, and the American system in particular tends to de-emphasize policymaking in relation to some of its other goals. The kinds of parliamentary democracies that prevail in Europe tend to prioritize muscular policy action. They often empower the majority coalition in the legislature to act fairly quickly and efficiently as long as its majority holds. That majority was chosen by the public to wield power, and so it should govern and then be judged by voters again. The American system almost never simply empowers any majority in that way. It rather insists on restraints that slow and structure decision-making and require broad and durable coalitions, both within and across different institutions. One implication of this distinctly American kind of constitutionalism is that it deprioritizes substantive policy outcomes and instead prioritizes a kind of structured decision-making and broad accommodations. It assumes that addressing a public problem is not a matter of finding the best technical solution, but of finding a solution that is most satisfactory to the relevant community on the whole. The goal is to address a problem in a way that people are happy with and feel is reflective of some understanding of their wishes and desires. And for that reason, the American system often implicitly prefers doing nothing over enacting aggressive policy programs by narrow legislative margins. All four of the other ways of thinking about the character of the Constitution, as a legal, institutional, political, and unifying framework, militate in favor of that kind of policy restraint. And frustration with that restrained or gridlocked character of the system often leads people to try to elevate policy outcomes above procedural constraints and institutional boundaries. Even constitutional officers themselves do this a lot. The courts might prioritize Congress's goals in healthcare legislation, for example, over the letter of the laws that it writes or over the separation of powers. A president might decide that his administration has to change the immigration system or forgive student loan debt if Congress won't do it. Members of Congress might create a federal program that can fund itself without requiring regular appropriations, just to pick a few examples out of the last 5 minutes. In each case, the people involved treat our system of government as a means to a policy end at the expense of its character or its limits. Sometimes those actions are illegal. Sometimes they're just contrary to the spirit of the Constitution. Either way, they express a desire to treat the Constitution exclusively as a policy instrument. It is such an instrument, but not exclusively. Now, although the legalistic and policy-centric approaches to the Constitution are in tension in many respects, both of them focus above all on the powers that the system grants its different parts, whether with an eye to the limits or the uses of those powers. But if you consider the questions that were taken up by the framers at the Constitutional Convention, you'll find that they spent more time thinking about structures than about powers. They were, in a sense, obsessed with institutional design. And so third, we might approach the Constitution as an institutional framework, a set of formalized bodies, a Congress, a presidency, a court, that each has a distinct structure and character and carries out a particular kind of work. Our constitutional system is made up of these interlocking institutions, and it's given shape by their forms. We're not used to thinking of political forms in this way. Our usual approach to the separation of powers leaves us imagining that there's a kind of fungible commodity called power that the different branches of our government exercise, so that the question is who has more of it and who has less of it. But our system does not just divide the power of the national government into three. It divides it among legislative, executive, and judicial institutions, each of which is expected to exercise its authorities differently and for a different purpose, in a different way. Congress generally frames and authorizes government actions. It makes laws that channel public power and allocate public resources. In a complex society like ours, that kind of framing work is necessarily the product of accommodation and compromise, and the work of the Congress is therefore necessarily plural. It's the work of many and involves conciliation among them. The presidency, meanwhile, generally acts within the structures established by the laws that Congress frames. The purpose of the office is action, and its institutional design reflects that. The president reacts to events, adjusts to pressures, makes concrete choices among permissible options in complicated situations. Action like that is necessarily a singular endeavor, not a group activity. And to be carried off well, it requires energy and boldness and steadiness and focus and ambition. The executive branch of our government is meant to enable those virtues in the individual who's chosen to exercise the power that it has. And the judiciary then steps in after laws have been framed and actions have been acted and reviews them in response to cases and complaints to make sure the general rules have been applied appropriately in particular circumstances. It neither makes laws nor acts to execute them, but assesses the behavior of other people. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that the Congress is expected to frame for the future, the president is expected to act in the present, and the courts are expected to assess the past. Now, these boundaries are never quite perfectly clean. In fact, as James Madison noted in Federalist 48, to achieve the primary purpose of the separation of these branches, which is the prevention of abuses of power, it's actually necessary to intermix the branches a little at the margins. So the president not only has a veto power over legislation, but is invited in the text of the Constitution to occasionally think like a legislator and recommend measures to Congress. Congress is given a role in foreign policy and has oversight over the entire federal bureaucracy, and the Senate has to approve treaties and confirm presidential appointments. The courts are more constrained in their own sphere, but they exercise a kind of oversight too, of course, and they can strike down both legislative and executive actions that are found to violate the Constitution or the laws. This mixing of authorities is marginal, though. And rather than give each branch a real share of the kind of work that the others do, it gives each branch some modest means to restrain the others in their own domains as a defensive measure. This intermixing is intended ultimately to preserve the separation between the branches and to insist on the differences between them. The most crucial of these differences are not about who has more power and who has less. They are fundamental distinctions of purpose and structure and form. And so they're best understood in institutional terms. That means that we need to think about the health of our system not only by whether the various players in it are transgressing the boundaries established around their powers and using those powers to good policy effect, but also by whether they're playing the kinds of roles assigned to them, exercising the kind of power they were given. When an administrative agency exercises an open-ended power to make general rules and then enforce them in specific circumstances, it's acting legislatively and judicially, even though it doesn't have a legislative or judicial form. And so it's violating the structure or logic of the Constitution. This is one way to describe what's wrong with much of the modern administrative state, legislative and judicial actions without legislative and judicial forms. When a president says, if Congress won't act, I will, he's threatening to violate the constitutional order because there are essentially no properly legislative actions that an executive could properly take instead. When a judge creates a novel policy or right of action, he's acting in ways that may be permitted to other constitutional officers, but not to judges. He's exercising a share of the power of our government, but in a forum not appropriate to the particular institution that he's part of. Even if actions like those are allowed by statutes or justified by loopholes that a clever lawyer can describe to an eager judge, they turn out to be counter-constitutional when we think about the Constitution in institutional and not just legal or policy-making terms. The institutional structures established by the Constitution call for certain forms of action and restraint by their occupants, and those constitutional officers should be judged in part by how they play those roles. Crucially, that means that an institutional approach to our system of government could help us see not only when one of the branches overreaches, but also when it underreaches, and so fails to do its necessary work. Congress today is plainly underactive in this way. Its members often want to shirk responsibility for hard decisions and tend to favor vague legislative mandates that describe popular goals but leave the tough governing details to other people. That's generally not illegal, and there's generally not much that courts can do about it. But an institutional perspective shows it to be a constitutional dereliction that does serious harm to our system of government. An institutional perspective can also help us to understand the complicated balance that the Constitution strikes between the need to empower the government to govern effectively and the need to restrain it and avert abuses of power. On this point, Walter Berns is an especially helpful guide. As he showed, that balance is ultimately maintained not by limits on the quantity of power granted to government, but by the structures, forms, and formalities built into the institutions that deploy that power. The structural complexity that's so often frustrating to energetic reformers aims both to moderate and legitimate uses of power, just as formality does in our social lives. Formalities are indirect, and constitutionalism seeks various means of making government action less direct, or as Walter put it in Taking the Constitution Seriously, of doing properly what has to be done politically. And ultimately, formalities like that also shape the character of our polity, or the political personality of our society. And so they point us toward the next facet of constitutionalism. Fourth, then, we might think about the Constitution as a political framework. This is the most capacious, also the most vague and nebulous of the modes of constitutionalism that we can think about. It refers to politics in its highest sense, not just as a contest for power, but as the common life of a community. And so it comes closest to the classical notion of a constitution, which is not so much the written charter of a government, but in Aristotle's terms, a certain ordering of the inhabitants of the city and the way of life of a body of citizens. In this sense, the Constitution is almost analogous to the soul of a polity. It describes the innermost character of our society and the meaning of citizenship and of authority in its life. To understand the Constitution in these kinds of political terms is therefore, for one thing, to contemplate the character of the regime that we have. As Jim Caesar at UVA has put this, quote, "Political constitutionalism understands the Constitution as a document that fixes certain ends of government activity, delineates a structure and arrangement of powers, but also encourages a certain tone to the operation of the institutions. By this understanding, it falls mostly to political actors making political decisions to protect and promote constitutional goals." It's by this light, by considering these kinds of questions about the proper tone of operation of our system, that we can see some of the dysfunctions of our politics in recent years as constitutional problems. Failures of responsibility that involve constitutional officers behaving like performers or seekers of celebrity, for example, are increasingly common in all of our institutions. They don't always involve a violation of any formal boundaries. They're not illegal. They generally can't be dealt with by litigation, but they nonetheless result from a kind of fundamental constitutional deformation, from derelictions of responsibility and corruptions of political culture. Violations of constitutional norms that are not legally enforceable more generally fall into this kind of category too. Confronted with that kind of behavior, as we have been all too often, we have to ask ourselves, not only is this technically permissible, but also something more like, does this belong in our kind of politics? That's a question that demands to be answered in terms of the purpose and goals of the Constitution, the sort of government it was aimed to create, the kind of society that it means to govern. Answers to it will be anchored in the ideals that shape our civic aspirations and in the common historical experiences that have forged us into a nation. They won't be as precise or as confident as answers that courts can give to strictly legal questions, and they may be open to a lot more debate and adjustment, but they're not less crucial for that. Often what's at issue when the political character of the Constitution is at stake, is not any one particular provision of the document, but its overall tenor, what Montesquieu called the spirit of the laws. It's that spirit, that general genius, as Hamilton calls it, of the American Republic that can be hard to pin down sometimes, but it does have a few broad characteristics that we can point to in trying to think it through. It is, for one thing, rooted in the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, truths that are foundational to the character of our society. The Constitution does not restate these truths, but they're a starting point for its essential republicanism. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Declaration can be used as an interpretive instrument by judges seeking to apply the Constitution in cases. There are maybe some rare instances when that might be appropriate, but the Declaration is most essential to the Constitution understood as a political framework, not a legal one. It makes sense of the spirit of the whole. The spirit of our Constitution is also given form by the ambitions laid out in its preamble. These also are generally not enforceable as law, but they're political ambitions in the very highest sense. They describe the goods that our government seeks to provide to its society, which are presumably the preconditions for the thriving of that society. And they remind us to think about our system of government not only in negative terms, in terms of what it protects us from and commits not to do to us, but also and more so in positive terms, in terms of what it offers us, demands from us, and commits to secure for us. The spirit of the Constitution is also plainly democratic in our modern sense of the term. It assumes that power is ultimately rooted in the people. There are some historians who have argued that the Constitution took a step back or away from the more radically democratic character of the Declaration of Independence, since it places restraints on majority power and recoils from any kind of radical or revolutionary politics. But I think the Constitution is actually much more democratic than the Declaration, which after all did not specify any particular form of government at all. It made no reference or commitment to majority rule, and even suggested that a wide variety of regimes could be legitimate if they were begun with the consent of the public. The Constitution is plainly committed to majority rule through representation in all of its key institutions, directly or indirectly, through regular elections at the end of the day. It builds upon the Declaration of Independence and completes it in a democratic direction. And it therefore stamps our political culture with an emphatically democratic temperament, which we certainly still have. But at the same time, the Constitution is also clearly committed to the protection of minority rights and individual freedoms. And so it does seek to restrain the uses of majority power. That, too, is evident in every one of its institutions and provisions, and is integral to the spirit of the kind of regime that it constitutes. The tension between the imperative to empower majorities and the imperative to protect minorities, what we now might call the democratic imperative and the liberal imperative, and the attempt to combine the two is responsible for a lot of the Constitution's structure and character, and for a lot of what is most complicated about it, most difficult to explain to students. At both the conceptual and the practical levels, the tension between democracy and liberalism is often also mediated in the constitutional system by republicanism. That's another essential element of the political framework of American constitutionalism, but it's one that has become less familiar to us over time. Republicanism is sometimes identified with just its procedural kinds of implications, especially with representative as opposed to direct democracy. But republicanism in both its classical and modern forms runs a lot deeper than that. It's more of a civic ethic than a system of government. At its heart is an idea of the human being and citizen that emphasizes our responsibilities to one another and to the common good. It counterbalances the democratic ethos because it values not just what we each want, but what is good for all of us. It counterbalances the liberal ethos because it values not just rights, but obligations. That kind of republicanism is the deepest political wellspring of the Constitution. But it has been, as I say, largely lost to us. It's become so unfamiliar that we often mistake the consequences of its absence now for symptoms of an excess of those ideas that it was meant to counteract. And so we say that we've become too liberal, when what we really mean to say is that we've become not Republican enough. American constitutionalism requires a distinctly Republican kind of virtue and can't really do without it. To be a free people able to take advantage of the kind of system of government established by our Constitution, we need also to be a people with the kind of civic virtue that might, as Madison put it in Federalist 55, justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. The character of the souls of our citizens and leaders matters immensely, and it's of great concern to the constitutional system understood in this political sense. A recovery of some sense of the meaning of republicanism is going to be necessary for any constitutional renewal, and that kind of recovery will require, in turn, a grasp of the Constitution as a political framework. But the political facet of the Constitution is not just the result of a collection of ideas and abstractions. It's also the product of an accumulated national experience and history. America is an idea, but it is not just an idea. America is also a nation filled with men and women who live together and share in common a set of experiences and roots and loves that render them into fellow citizens. The battles won and lost, the challenges overcome, achievements and failures, triumphs and tragedies that fill the chronicles of American history also fill the hearts and minds of the American people. And our political character cannot help but be formed and framed by that life lived in common. All of this is a lot more vague and fuzzy than the sort of stark legal doctrines and institutional blueprints that we might find when we talk about the Constitution in other terms. It serves a different purpose than those do, but it's not less crucial to the meaning of our Constitution and to its effectuation in practice. Again, maybe not by judges, but by the rest of us. The character of our Constitution as a political framework begins to help us see the enormously complicated and contradictory ambitions of our system of government. The framers sought a government that would be energetic but restrained, effective but limited, democratic but liberal and republican, responsive yet reflective, representative of a vast and fragmented society, yet able to focus upon national challenges. They approached the task of treating each of these seeming contradictions as a potentially creative tension, a source of vigor and balance. Now, there are risks to that kind of approach, and maybe the foremost risk inherent in it is the risk of disintegration. And so the Constitution was designed to pursue these varied ends in ways that explicitly try to avoid disintegration and disunion, and to pursue greater consolidation and unity. That's why the Constitution also has to be understood as structuring our solidarity, as describing what it is that constitutes us as a people. And so fifth and finally, we should think about our Constitution as a kind of framework for unity. This idea is inherent in the very notion of a constitution, in the very term, which describes a whole that is constituted by constituent parts. It's evident, too, in the very first ambition articulated in the preamble, which is to form a more perfect union. And it's apparent in the first person plural in which the document presents itself, beginning with its first word, we. But that we is aspirational as much as it is empirical, like the opening of the Declaration of Independence, which describes the Americans as one people connected by political bands with another, and so implies that it speaks for an already existing distinct nation rather than one being created. The Constitution opens by speaking on behalf of a united people, when in fact the unification of that people is one of its primary goals. It's a goal that the framers and the public knew would not be easy to achieve. The fearful prospect of disunity and even war among the states was very real to late 18th century Americans. And the need for union was often the first and foremost argument advanced by champions of the Constitution at the various state ratification debates. The first 23 of the 85 Federalist Papers are explicitly devoted to the need to preserve the Union, and almost all the rest touch upon that subject too. Sometimes the case for unity was advanced among the framers through aspirational descriptions of our society, like the opening of the preamble, which insisted that Americans were already united but had work to do to remain so. Charles Pinckney, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from South Carolina, insisted that, quoting Madison's notes here, "The people of the United States are perhaps the most singular of any we are acquainted with, because among them there are fewer distinctions of fortune and less of rank than among inhabitants of any other nation. They were, to a unique degree, one people." John Jay says something like this, even more so in Federalist 2. But there was more than a hint of wishful thinking in these kinds of assurances. It was no coincidence that unity was put forward as the first ambition of the reformed American regime in the preamble. Throughout the deliberations over the Constitution, a dark cloud of disunity hung in the air, disunity among the states and among the people. That challenge had to be kept in sight, and the Constitution does keep it in sight. It was built with a keen awareness of the plurality and fractiousness of the American nation. It was offered as a way to live with the reality of our diversity and division, aiming to mitigate their downsides without harboring the utopian illusion of eliminating that diversity or those divisions. The key framers of the system hoped that the fact of the multiplicity of American life did not have to mean that Americans would be irredeemably alienated from each other, embittered, in conflict. They didn't deny the reality of the diversity of interests and of opinions in our country, but they refused to believe that it had to mean that unity was impossible or not worth pursuing. Rather, the system they constructed presumes an idea of unity that takes that multiplicity for granted and attenuates disunity through common action. All the other facets of the Constitution contribute to this one. Through the institutions that it constructed, the boundaries that it set, the ambitions that it held out, the spirit of the polity that it helped to instantiate, the system was plainly intended to help forge common ground in American life, not just to occupy that kind of ground. It seeks to enable social peace, which cannot be taken for granted under modern conditions of pluralism. Social peace can offer a stable backdrop for political life. In a free society, it's not quiet, but raucous. It can't be achieved by conquest or by surrender, but only by mutual accommodation. It's the condition of differing without rejecting one another's legitimacy, disputing without being at war. The very idea of a written constitution that stands apart from regular legislation as the framework of a regime is rooted in the ambition to establish some such common ground in a permanently fractious society. By drawing a distinction between views about the system of government and views about policy and interest, it stakes out some space for agreement that can allow our disagreements to be dealt with more constructively. Our system can withstand a lot of discord, provided that we do share a general understanding of the character and purpose of the Constitution itself. That's why some restoration of that kind of understanding is an essential precondition to the recovery of our civic culture. But that culture, even in moments of relative unity, is a culture of disagreement. The breakdown of political culture in our day is not a function of our having forgotten how to agree with each other, but of our having forgotten how to disagree with each other. And that's what our Constitution can better enable us to do. As a framework for unity, it functions as a means of rendering disagreement more constructive. And it does that above all by rendering disputing factions in our politics into parties to a substantive debate about how to proceed together. To engage in that debate, to participate in the intense dynamic struggles that constitute American political life, is to practice constitutionalism. It is the work of citizens, and in their name, it is also the work of public officials. The work of judges is above all intended to sustain the space for that civic life, rather than to occupy or overtake that space. And in that sense, the role of law in the American constitutional vision is vital but limited. It exists to limit, and therefore it must itself be limited. This, too, was a core insight that Walter Berns illuminated through his vital work. To take the Constitution seriously, which is our task as citizens, we have to take it in full, and so to see what it demands of us as citizens of a republic. Constitutionalism is everyone's work. It's an insight that cannot be repeated too often, and it's an insight that we who are Walter's successors here at AI have tried to make into a guiding light for our own work. And we're proud to notice and to show that we learned it from Walter Berns, and that we teach it in no small measure in his name. Walter's last lecture here at AI was a celebration of Abraham Lincoln on his 200th birthday. It's online, it's very much worth your while. In his concluding words in that lecture, his final words, you might say, as an AI scholar, Walter said this, I quote, "We say that a man can be known by the company he keeps, and so I say that a nation, a people, can be known and judged by its heroes, by whom it honors above all others. We pay ourselves the greatest compliment when we say that Abraham Lincoln is that man for us." I think the same can be said of this institution. We pay ourselves the greatest compliment when we say that Walter Berns was our teacher on all things constitutional. That's a summary of what this lecture has been, and it's no coincidence that we've named this series of lectures for Walter. And that, above all, is why I'm honored to be here tonight, repeating and restating things I learned from Walter Berns. Thank you very much.
That was excellent, and I don't just say that because you're my boss.
But also for that reason.
My apologies for those online. I should have earlier on told you that if you want to ask a question, submit a question, you can email Nicole Penn. That's nicole.penn, P-E-N-N, and then at aei.org, or you can use Twitter, hashtag Constitution Day AEI.
Don't use Twitter.
Yeah, so that's, yeah, good point. So let's start with an easy question, or to borrow from Lenin, what's to be done? I mean, this very fulsome understanding of the Constitution obviously no longer is really prevalent.
Yeah.
So, you know, what kind of 2 or 3 things you think one can begin to dig out of this hole?
Yeah. Well, obviously that's a very hard question, but it's a question that we have to think about at a place like this. I think part of what it means to get to know the Constitution in full has to be an educational enterprise. And we have to think about these ideas as what ought to be essential to the content of civics education. I think we're living in a moment of a kind of renewal of interest in civics, or at least a moment that pretends to be newly interested in civics. We should call its bluff and work on ways that can help that interest be directed toward a fuller understanding of the Constitution. It is part of what we're doing, but I think it has to be done by a lot of people who are concerned for a constitutional renewal. We just have to talk about it. We have to have this be the common sense of what the Constitution means. And I think there is a way by articulating this case as the natural way to understand the Constitution to help it fill the vacuum that's been left by the absence of civic education. And that can be done in a way that's directed toward our institutions too, directed toward members of Congress, directed toward judges and others. There's an example of that. I mean, and I think AI has been an example of that. The transformation of the judiciary over the last 40 years began here in the work of people like Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork. It began as an institutional, as an intellectual project, as a set of ideas. And the notion that it would transform the courts themselves, I think, was hard to imagine. But it is by advancing ideas in the public square that you can ultimately help them matter. I think that's a key piece of it. But there also has to be an agenda of constitutional reform that's grounded in some of this. To my mind, that's especially a reform of Congress. Mm-hmm. Congress has forgotten its job, and its job begins with what is written in the Constitution. It would help members to know it. I think if you ask members what their jobs are now, what they say would not really remind you of the Constitution, and it ought to. So there too, I think there's educational work to be advanced, and we shouldn't underestimate the potential of that kind of work to make a difference in helping people see what their role is, what their job is. The job of a member of Congress is actually kind of attractive, or it should be, to ambitious people. I think it can be more enjoyable than what members do now, which wouldn't be a high bar. And so helping them see that, I think, can make a real difference. And
yeah, no, it's interesting just watching the so-called presidential debate the other evening. The lack of any kind of consideration that there was a limit for what the constitutional role of the presidency was or could be, as opposed to just simply, you know, sort of the presidency is be-all, end-all of everything. I mean, it's really quite striking.
I think presidents, you know, I think elites in general in America have lost the sense that it can be empowering to say, I don't have the power to do that. That's beyond what I can do. It's actually very empowering to say that. It helps people trust you, and it also helps to put pressure on other people in the system who can move that ball. But presidents now have lost the knack for seeing the limits of what they can do on their own, and so they're a lot worse at pressuring the rest of the system, and they're a lot harder to trust.
Yeah, yeah. I was particularly struck by, there's one line towards the end, you say, republicanism is the deepest wellspring of the Constitution, but has been lost to us. I mean, one that's struck by, when reads the Federalist Paper, for example, Madison has a very limited definition of republicanism.
Yeah.
Is this a case of the originalism not being adequate to the Constitution?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there is a kind of struggle underneath the debates you find at the convention to own the term republicanism. I think it's just a fact that the anti-federalists own it more naturally than the federalists, and therefore, like the term federalist itself, the federalists very wisely tried to just take ownership of the concept. And Madison offers a definition of republicanism several times, and especially in Federalist 10, that I think is pretty ridiculous, that just simply describes republicanism as representative democracy. And there's a way in which republicanism is in part that, but that's certainly not what his critics meant by republicanism, and it's not, I think, what anybody who looks at the Republican tradition would mean by it. I think there is a deeper republicanism rooted in classical republicanism, but possessed of a modern character, which is to say, that does express itself in representative democracy, that is very important to how Americans tended to think about government in the founding era, that can still be very useful to us in thinking about government, because it's a political theory that is better up to the task of actually describing American political life. The theories we do have are very thin and shallow. They force us to talk in kind of cold, mechanical terms and to talk about rights and in radically individualist ways. And all that's part of what we are. But I don't think it's possible to understand American citizenship without thinking about obligations to your country, obviously. And the liberal theories we have don't offer us enough of vocabulary to do that, to the point that some people will say, well, we just don't have that because liberalism doesn't provide it. Well, I don't think they define liberalism quite properly, but I also think that they ignore the reality of republicanism. And that's easy to do now because we have mostly lost that vocabulary. Yeah. But look, it's worth acknowledging that republicanism was always a confusing term. There's a commitment in the Constitution for the federal government to provide a Republican form of government to all the states. And John Adams famously says that he can't find anybody who knows what the hell that's supposed to mean. And he knew people who, wrote those words. So that's always been a problem. That's not a new problem. But I do think that a recovery of republicanism is a useful way to think about some of the work we have to do.
One final one for me. So talking about the Constitution, but of course one of the major elements of our political order is our political parties. How do you reconcile, so the Constitution is an ordering document, not just simply a legal document. So how does that impact how we think about parties and how American parties are developed? How constitutional are they and how perhaps not?
Yeah, I think there is a palpable desire among the framers of the Constitution to avoid permanent parties. They lost that desire pretty quickly. Once they started actually operating in the new system, these very same people became the party builders. But I think it took a while for a party system to emerge that was a good fit for the Madisonian constitutional system. That did happen. I think it happened in particular in response to the peculiar demands of the Electoral College, which require an absolute majority of electors to elect a president, which meant that if you have more than 2 serious candidates for president, there's a big chance that the election goes to the House. This happened twice, and that was enough. And you find people in the 3rd decade of the 19th century working on party institutions that look a lot like the American party system we know. Martin Van Buren thinks of the parties as a way to prepare coalition builders who can then build coalitions in the constitutional system. I think that's the right way to think about it. And I think the American party system at its best can be the missing piece of the puzzle of our Constitution. It is not currently at its best, as you may have noticed. And in thinking about how it could be better, I think we have to see it as a missing piece in the constitutional puzzle.
Okay. So, as you notice, I had to switch glasses. This is the reason why I'm a senior fellow. So, so raise your hand, please. Identify yourself and wait for the microphone. It's coming.
Thank you. I might well overpower the microphone, so I'll try to be careful here. My name is Christian Johnson, and I was wondering if you could comment on one of the other central tensions here, a thread I see through all five, I'm going to mangle the metaphors, through all five lenses, perhaps, or pillars, is of consensus building. That is ultimately the purpose of this document, is to forge a consensus in this wildly disparate empire, continental empire, even and as of 1787. But that process, even of creating that document, was secret. And the notes from the convention were not published until 50 years later, after everyone was safely dead. And we now face a world in which we have radical transparency. And that transparency militates against the forming of a consensus. It really militates against the forming of even basic compromise. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on how do we try to rebuild that in a very different landscape, one that was already difficult even in 1787?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that it was difficult then too, and that they needed to work on it too. The decision to have the convention in private, to seal the windows in Philadelphia in the summer, was a self-conscious choice. And the idea behind it is that it is very hard to negotiate in public. I think it's impossible, really, to negotiate in public. And that certainly ought to suggest that those of our institutions whose work is negotiation should find some protected spaces for themselves to do that work. This is particularly important for the legislature. And look, I think that televising congressional committee work was a mistake. I've written that. I was invited on C-SPAN to make that argument, and it was very awkward. It's a little like telling your mother that you didn't like the meatloaf. I'm a big fan of C-SPAN, but I think that the response from Congress probably can't be to push out the cameras. It probably has to be to create new forms of work that are not televised and are not public and are not on the internet. Committee business sessions that are separate from hearings. They can still berate the president of Harvard at a hearing, that's great. But if they actually mean to mark up a bill and negotiate with each other, they need some degree of privacy. I think it can work with some modest publicity. That is, there can be people in the room watching, but to have cameras in the room makes a very big difference. The courts know this very well, and the Supreme Court in particular has resisted televising for that reason, even though the public can attend oral arguments. And certainly real negotiation has to happen in private. I would say the real negotiation still does happen in private. It's just that the only places that are private now are the leadership offices at midnight before a government shutdown, and that's where all the work gets done, because that's the only place where it could get done. So there have to be more places where it could get done. And yeah, I think that requires an argument for limits on transparency that's easier for me to make than for someone running for office, but that I think is undeniable.
It also would seem to push more of that debate into the executive branch.
Well, that's part of what happens, right? The regulators do act in privacy, in some degree of privacy anyway. And yeah, they're more effective in part as a result of that. So,
Back in the back here.
Thank you. Abe Shulsky from the Hudson Institute. To go back to the political parties issue, if they're going to be the consensus builders, that would seem to imply that they have to be the sort of run by the pols in a way. I mean, as they certainly were up until recently.
Yeah.
Would you just come out and say, we've got to get rid of primaries for the most part and allow a political party that is run by pros to figure out, okay, what's the biggest and best consensus we can put together, because that won't happen in a primary.
It's very easy for me to say that we should get rid of the primaries. Yes, absolutely, I think we should. The question is that even imaginable, given that the people who would have to do it are the people who are accountable right now to primary voters? So yes, I think we would be better off with systems of candidate selection that were more accountable to party elites, let's just say it. I don't think that's likely to happen. And so the question is, how do you move forward from the primary system rather than how do you move backward from it? And there, I think there's room to experiment with various modes of candidate selection that are more likely to choose more broadly appealing candidates. If you had asked me about ranked choice voting 10 years ago, I would have said it's a gimmick meant to elect even more lefty people in Oregon. But ranked choice in the primaries, not in the general election. In general elections, ranked choice weakens parties, and I want to strengthen them. But in the primaries, ranked choice can be a way for parties to choose more broadly appealing candidates. And we've seen that happen now a number of times. I think the state parties would have to first learn that what they're doing isn't working, which oddly neither party can see, even though they're both losing every election for the last 30 years. We haven't had a majority party in America since the 1990s, and you would think that that would lead the parties to ask themselves, how could we become a majority party? I think the answer to that has to run through some changes to their modes of candidate selection, which are just very badly suited to our political culture now, very badly suited to the purpose of the parties, which is to build broad coalitions. They should have an interest in it. It would help them win. That's their job. But we find ourselves in this perverse place where they have to be persuaded to win. And they're much more in the business of hunting heretics than winning converts right now.
It'll be interesting if Vice President Harris wins.
That's right. We've seen an example of a party saying, oh, we're going to lose, let's run somebody else. And everybody in the country is like, can they do that? And yeah, they can. And Republicans could do it too. So yeah, if that works, I think there could be a moment where the parties ask themselves, maybe we could just try to win elections. Yeah. That'd be nice.
All right, we have only time for one more question, but right here.
Thank you. Yes, Rick LaRue. A question about amendments, not necessarily specific ones that you might anticipate, but the prospects and what would have to occur to enable them to ultimately prevail. It's sort of like the other end of starting with civic education. Yeah. There is historically, of course, periods where we have gaps in amendments when the conventional wisdom, as I think it is today, is that amending the Constitution is impossible. What do you see and how might that evolution occur if it will in fact be cyclical or spiral the way Putnam presents it? Yeah. And then the only amendment, you can speak to any amendment should you wish to, but the only one that I'd be curious about, if you're familiar with the National Center, Constitution Center's Constitution Drafting Project, where they would make amending the Constitution still difficult in terms of supermajorities, but with slightly lesser majorities, both out of Congress and for state ratification. Thank you.
Yeah, I was a little confused by that idea of theirs, because I don't think we're anywhere near constitutional. I just don't know what it would change to make it a little bit easier. I think if you got to the level that they're describing, you would probably also get to the level that the Constitution requires. I'm a conservative, and I don't currently see a problem to which amending the Constitution would be a solution in this moment. That may be dispositional, but it's a fact. So that in general, I don't think the problem we have now is that the Constitution stands in the way of public action. I don't think we have these big majorities that are being restrained by the Constitution from getting their will accomplished. Our problem is that we don't have majorities, and the Constitution is actually built to form them. It's built to drive us into modes of engagement and accommodation that can help us build coalitions. And we're not doing that. We're resisting doing it with great force. And so I think what we're living through is a failure of constitutional practice more than a failure of constitutional design. It's certainly imaginable that we get to a place where our political culture is so altered that we can agree on some amendments that seem necessary. Things change, right? I mean, the kind of 50-50 period we're living through is not forever. It hasn't been the norm. You know, in 1984, there was a presidential election that somebody won with 49 states. That happened in America. So things do change, but in the moment we're living in now, I think we're very far from the place where amending the Constitution is the step we should be thinking about. And I don't think that our frustrations should be channeled toward breaking the Constitution. Our frustrations should be channeled toward practicing it, toward building broader coalitions so that we might address some public problems. And so I guess that's to say my thinking about the challenges we face generally isn't directed to constitutional amendments. But you're right that they come in bunches. They come in moments when several amendments pass in a short period of time, and then we go through a generation and 2 generations without any.
Well, on that, I think, really quite positive note, I'm all in favor of an amendment to have the Senate go back to being elected by the state legislators. But anyway, please join me in thanking Yuval and a marvelous presentation and address. Thank you.
Thank you.